Now, I have to tell you that as I was getting ready for this message, I realized I did not understand what it meant to give in grace. I knew what it meant to give in thanks for God's grace. But I didn't know what it meant to give in grace. I knew what it meant to think about giving generously as I have received generously from God. But all of that is a little bit different than giving in grace. In our reading today from 2 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, Paul is writing to a church in Corinth about giving. And he draws an example of another church that he had started from Macedonia. We'll talk about that in a moment. But he talks about how those churches in Macedonia had received God's grace and were able to give in grace. So that begins our reading. There we go. Paul begins, "We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia." Just a little bit of background. The church in Corinth that Paul had begun was perhaps one of the more wealthy churches that Paul was associated. They had an abundance of material ability and gain because they were a church in the inner city. It was a church of merchants and owners, as well as the whole range of society in Corinth. They had plenty, but there was a way in which they lacked a servant heart. They had so much, but they didn't quite know what it meant to have that gift of joy in Jesus. So Paul is saying, you know, folks, there is another way of living. There's another way of understanding your relationship to God and your life of stewardship. And he goes back to the experience that he had with a group of churches in Macedonia. And if you look up there at the top, you'll see that word Macedonia. There's two churches in particular, Philippi and Thessalonica. We think of them as the letters to the Philippians and the Thessalonians. Now, those two churches were not as well off. They didn't have a material abundance, and also because of where they were and the political climate of the time, they experienced persecution and suffering. And yet, even in the midst of that challenge that was both physical and material, it was like their life was filled with joy. And Paul talks about their life in God's grace. We continue. "For during a severe ordeal of affliction, persecution, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave to their means and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints, and this not merely as we expected. They gave of themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God to us." Paul is describing a church that has been captivated or captured by God's grace. And what does that mean, to be captured in grace? Well, actually, you all had a privilege last Sunday. Every Sunday we put this globe out, and the kids are invited to come forward to put their offering in. It just so happened on, I think, the Saturday before, we'd had a funeral service here, and so the globe was put back in the sacristy. And those in the front could see that was the case, but Craig's youngest son, Brock, didn't see that, and so he came, marched his way down to put his offering in the globe. And except the globe wasn't there. So he looked behind the altar, and he looked behind the altar here. And the fun thing about it is that he was keeping beat to the bells up at the top. And he was kind of dancing his way around the front. Finally, he looked at me, he came over to me, and in a voice I'm sure many of you heard, he said, Pastor Steve, where's the globe?" And I knew where it was. So I asked Pastor Craig, his dad, "Could you give me the globe?" We passed it out over the top. We put it over here, and then Brock danced his way across the front, put his offering in the globe. At the same time, they finished the bells, and so we erupted in applause. Why? Because we just saw a visual sermon about what it means to give in grace. We saw a visual sermon about what it means to give, being captured by the gospel. We often think of grace as a noun, a gift, something we get from God. But grace is also a verb. It describes how God moves in on us. Grace is a verb. It describes how the love and the grace of God dance their way into our heart. Every Sunday, when the kids come forward and place their offering in the globe, we see that visual lesson about giving and grace when they dance and twirl and skip and jump up to the front, put their offering in the globe, take a peek to see what happens to it, and then scamper back to the pew with their parents. I have to confess, when it comes to this day, in fact, I've stocked the pond here with my own estimate of giving, that oftentimes when I think about this moment, I think more in terms of a calculation. Okay, now what are we going to do this year? Last week, we had that card that was in your bulletin, and there was a table, talking about percentage giving, and there was a step chart to kind of help us think in practical, real sort of ways. Well, what are we going to do this year? What's going to be my response this year, and what does it mean for me to grow in my giving? But that really doesn't say everything about what it means to give, because it's also about just not the calculation, but that sense of being captured in the joy of God. What does it mean to be captured? Just in our reading, Paul talks about abundant joy, to give voluntarily, to give ourselves first to the Lord. Next summer, there's a group of members who will be traveling to Tanzania, to our partner congregation at Same Parish. A number of churches here in the Southeast Synod of Iowa have been partnered with specific congregations in that partner synod in Tanzania. And we're going to be taking a group of a couple of people, 3 or 4, to that congregation in Same, so that we might build on that partnership and those relationships. There's something that we have to give, but there's also something that we have to receive. And I think about the practice of offering that often is a part of the churches in Africa, where the offering is incorporated into a dance as people bring their offerings to God. And we have a clip, maybe Jacob, if you want to show that right now. Now, I'm not sure I know how to move that way. I'm Norwegian, and I don't have to say anything more than that. Though I might say some might be curious to come along just simply to see me move in grace. Now, I'm not asking you to dance like that down the aisle to place your estimate of givings and your offering in the basket today. That's not really what it's about. But what I am saying is that to give in grace is more about being captured than about calculating. That giving in grace is about tapping into the music of the gospel as it dances its way into our heart. Paul is inviting the people of the church in Corinth to connect with the energy and the music of the gospel in their life and to respond. We continue in our reading. So Paul says, we might urge Titus, that as he had already made a beginning in you, there in the church of Corinth, that he might complete this generous undertaking with you. What Paul is talking about is that with the church in Corinth and the churches in Macedonia, he is actually about a fundraising project, a mission project to gather funds to bring to the church in Jerusalem that was under extreme poverty and extreme persecution. Each of the mission trips Paul would take, he would gather an offering and then bring it back to that church in Jerusalem. And it wasn't just simply a one-time thing, but it was really a plan for over the course of a year. And so Paul would then come back, gather the offering, and bring it to support the mission of God in Jerusalem. So we continue. Now as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. Notice how Paul is using the gifts or the language of spiritual gifts. That is giving in gratitude, giving with generosity, and it all goes back to God's gift in Jesus Christ and be shaped by that gift. You know, if you really want to know what it means to give in grace, to give of your whole self, actually we all know what that means. When you fall in love, you give your whole self to the one you love. When you fall in love, when you go out for a meal or go out for a date or do something, there is a way in which you don't calculate. You just simply go and do and enjoy, and you give your full self in that moment. And you are generous in your giving. When you fall in love, the day it's more like a dance than anything else. It's more of a song than anything else. And Paul is saying, our stewardship can be like that. Giving in grace is falling in love with God just as God has fallen in love with you. We continue. I do not say this as a command, but I am testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others, for you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. A week ago at the men's group, one of the guys said, we talk about grace all the time, but I have to tell you, Pastor, it always seems like an abstract idea. I'm not sure how to get my hands on that. What is grace? Well, we talk about, grace in relationship to the things we know. Justice is getting what you deserve. Mercy is avoiding what you deserve. Grace is getting something better than you deserve. But it's really more than that. Paul is saying grace is not simply something that you receive, but it also has to do with the expense that God went through to give you that gift. The price that Jesus paid to give you that gift. I mean, how does Paul put it? He says, Jesus was rich, yet for your sake he became poor. In other words, he traded the riches and comfort of life with God for the rigors of life on earth so that we might know the comfort and the riches of God's promise in Jesus. He suffered and died so that we might know peace and life. There's kind of this exchange that happens in Jesus. In a way, in Jesus, what God says here, I'll give you my riches for your poverty. I'll give you my forgiveness for your sin. I'll give you my healing for your brokenness. I'll give you my life for your dying. So often it may seem that grace is an abstract idea, but when you begin to think about it, that our experience in grace is like a song of God sung into the ugliness of the world, that grace is more like the dance music of God skipping into our heart. We continue. So in this manner, I'm giving you advice. It is appropriate for you who began your last year not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Now finish doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. I mean, I don't mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you, but it's a question of a fair balance between your present abundance and their need, that is the need in Macedonia, the need in Jerusalem, so that their abundance of joy, may be for you the occasion for your need to recognize that gift of God's grace, in order that there may be a fair balance. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, the one who had little did not have too little. We talk about, when it comes to giving, about proportionate share giving, that we're simply invited to give as we have received. It's not so much an equal sacrifice as an equal or shared sacrifice of the heart. Not an equal amount, but rather a shared spirit of joy in giving. And those words actually come from this passage in Paul, 2 Corinthians. Paul, is describing something more than simply what we do with a budget. Paul is describing what we do when we are captured by grace. And what Paul is saying is, do you hear the music of the gospel? Do you hear the dance of God's love? Because when you do, you discover what it means to give of yourself, to give your whole self to God. And to give not in an obligation, but rather to give in the freedom of the gospel. Because when that happens, our giving, our stewardship, our discipleship, it's more like a dance than anything else. Amen.